My name is Dean Carlson, and I want to bring greetings to OCA Africa from your friends, your brothers and sisters at One Challenge USA. Together we are part of a global movement that began back in the 1950s and spread from Asia to Latin America, from Latin America to Europe, and then to Africa. And you're part of a movement that is known for its innovation, its willingness to dream big as a nation and as a continent, to dream God's dreams alongside local leaders and helping those leaders fulfill the vision God's given them for discipling their nation. And OC does this all around the world. Some of the innovations that have happened over the decades was the launch of the Dawn, or Discipling a Whole Nation movement, and the whole idea of saturation church planning, putting a church, a healthy church, within easy access of every person in every place among every type of community. Back in the 1980s, OC helped to lead the way in promoting majority world missions, identifying the fact that the center of global Christianity was shifting from the global north to the majority world, and that God was raising up missionaries from China, from the Philippines, from Africa, from Latin America, and that it's a new day of partnering that we have been called into. And OC was issuing that clarion call to the global church to recognize and affirm what God is doing. And we've been involved very much in missiological research. OC has one of the largest missiological research teams scattered in different countries in the world today to research the status of the Great Commission for books such as Operation World or the World Christian Encyclopedia. Sports ministries also was one of the first innovations of OC back in the 1950s. The very first sports ministry team that went out ever was from the U.S. to China, or to Taiwan. And that began a movement around the world that's catalyzed now hundreds of sports ministries. And in fact, it was in the 1970s that OC began to send sports teams to Africa. Based on invitations from key African leaders in different parts of the continents, we began to send sports teams in. That led to invitations to begin to provide leadership training in different contexts, impact ministries. And it was in the 1980s, actually in 84 and 85, that OC was invited to launch its first team on the ground in Africa. And that occurred in Kenya, and was primarily in partnership initially with the African Inland Church and then later with the Evangelical Alliance of Kenya. And that first team was comprised of two Kenyan families, both from different tribes. Joseph Mahuta was the team leader. There was two Ethiopian families and then four American families. And they worked side by side in Barnabas ministry alongside Kenyan leaders to help provide leadership training, pastoral training, marriage seminars for leaders, etc., across the country of Kenya into southern Sudan and surrounding countries, also Uganda, along the way. We were involved with Daystar University, helping to equip leaders through formal education, and the team helped to start the Church Growth Bulletin of Kenya that became later known as the Church Leader in Africa, which we took over in Southern Africa, or when I was part of you there, and was a great tool to encourage leaders in the trenches and put some tools in their hands to help them be more sustainable and effective in ministry. Well, OC was invited into Southern Africa in 1985, 86, as our initial leaders met with leaders from 30 denominations in Harare in Zimbabwe to talk about the possibility of a national research process to identify unchurched areas. That led to an invitation to host a nationwide congress. It was called the Discipling Zimbabwe Congress. Peter Wagner, church growth expert, was part of that. Ngwiza Mkandla, Richmond Chiandiza, other leaders were the primary hosts of that gathering. That launched in Zimbabwe the Zimbabwe National Evangelism Task, a full-on research process that led to Target 2000 in 1992 at the University of Zimbabwe that drew together 60 denominations, their official representatives from Assemblies of God to the Anglican, to consider the state of the harvest and to deliberately raise up church planners and see churches multiplied within an easy walk of everyone in the nation. As that process unfolded then, OC helped Zimbabwean leaders, working with the Evangelical Fellowship of Zimbabwe and a host of denominational and organizational leaders. We worked to hold leadership consultations in 16 provincial locations, 16 locations in the 10 provinces of Zimbabwe, to focus on areas of how are leaders developed in Zimbabwe, how are churches best planted, what's the spiritual warfare element to that, and how can we send out people beyond our borders. Well, Zimbabwe saw a move of God. In the 1980s, we saw 10,000 churches planted. I did my doctoral dissertation on that. 10,000 churches were planted and 1,200 churches across the borders of Zimbabwe to surrounding countries. And we celebrated that and focused on healthy church growth as part of the ongoing process and mission sending. Well, though we had impact ministry at the beginning, it was in 1988 that the first OC missionaries moved, and we moved to Swaziland. That was because of the state of the country, the Marxist government at that time in Zimbabwe. We weren't sure of the continuation of visas. And we received an invitation from the Swaziland Conference of Churches to come assist them in leader development, church growth, church planning across Swaziland. And I remember taking 12 Swazi leaders from 10 denominations to see what was happening in Zimbabwe at the 1992 Congress. They came back fired up to do something similar in Swaziland. And that launched a national research process across Swaziland to identify unchurched areas and encouragement to the various denominations to move from where you are to where you're not and take the good news of Jesus and see it lived out where Jesus is not yet named. I arrived in 1989 and had the great privilege to be part of that process. Was asked to be the field director in 1992. Just a young guy, but OC entrusted a younger leader with responsibility. And together we partnered with the body of Christ in Swaziland, in Zimbabwe, and then in Mozambique. As the war was winding down, Barbosa began to fly into Kilimani and Beira and other places. And then eventually we drove in to do pastors' consultations, which led to an invitation from the Evangelical Alliance of Mozambique, Pastor Zimba at that time, to place a team in Maputo, which we've done, and that's now populated by Brazilian St. Paul missionaries. And as South Africa was undergoing tremendous transformation, we were watching across the border from Swaziland, praying into South Africa, and in 1994, in 1995, we began to do research on what is God doing in the new South Africa. What are the needs of the Great Commission? What are the opportunities? Is there some way that we could be of assistance? We met with about 15 national leaders across the country, from Michael Cassidy to Masan Tla and many others in between, to see what is God doing? What's your vision for the future? How can the Evangelical Alliance of South Africa, newly formed, fulfill its vision of serving the country and seeing it mobilize for discipling the nation? And so as a result of those surveys and interviews, the invitation came. And that came through the voice of Masan Tla, one of your board members in TISA, leading TISA in its new era at that time. And we heard God's voice in that Macedonian call. And we moved from Swaziland in 1996 to Johannesburg to begin serving alongside TISA, helping to form the Church Planting Alliance and all. And it was in that time that OC became involved in, the 82,000 and Beyond movement in the 1990s. That was a global movement to identify unreached peoples and see the church mobilized into those areas. We were part of the Southern Africa Expression. And then I was there at the launch of the Movement for African National Initiatives in the year 2000 in Jerusalem, where there were 360 leaders from 36 nations gathered together. And they said, let us launch our own African movement and to identify least reached areas and mobilize the existing church to go to those areas in their countries, in their regions, and ultimately to go northward to North Africa and into the uttermost parts of the earth. And I was invited to be the Southern Africa coordinator from 2005 to 2008, culminating with the Southern Africa, the Mani SA '08 consultation that drew together 13 nations of the Lusophone, English-speaking, and islands of Southern Africa. I was then commissioned, and when I was invited to come back to the U.S. to serve as the VP of Global Ministries, Monty in the Church in Africa commissioned me to go out in a role that they call Global Ambassador or International Liaison to help develop linkages, partnerships with other movements in other continents. So we began by connecting them to Comibom, the leadership of 30,000 missionaries from Latin America. We had meetings together in Latin America and in Africa. We connected with the North Africa Partnership. Carl and I connected with the Greater China 2030 movement in Beijing, and we saw the initiation of a Chinese delegation to the Mani consultation in Ethiopia. God was just moving in amazing ways. And when you come alongside visionary leaders whose hearts are surrendered to the Lord, who want to live biblically and to see the fulfillment of the Great Commission in and from their nation, it is amazing what God can do. When you come together and no one cares who gets the credit but the Lord, it's amazing how God shows up and the kingdom advances. And so I was thrilled when OC decentralized from a U.S. originated organization in 2010. This happened in the Philippines to send 8 sending nations, 8 or 10 at that time, and then expanded to 15 sending nations or entities, including OC Africa. What an exciting moment for OC Africa to take forward its vision of raising up and sending out Southern Africans into the harvest, where the gospel is most needed. And so you've been of great encouragement to the OC Global Alliance. We're inspired by your vision, by your creativity, by your tenacity, and we want to go forward with you into the future to trust the Lord, to do everything in His heart, and mobilizing the body of Christ to do what Jesus asked us to do. Go and make disciples of all nations, and to love our neighborhoods like Jesus. And so we celebrate you. We want to affirm you, and I'm grateful to participate in this worldview gathering today. So blessings to you from OC USA, and much love to you from the Carlsons.